The temperature inside the room read 50 degrees Fahrenheit. Outside, the thermometer nailed to the barn post had stopped registering anything useful 2 days ago. The last number Wren Calloway had recorded before the mercury dropped below the marked scale was -28. That was 36 hours ago. She had not lit the small stove box since the first night of the storm. Yet the air in the room beneath the barn floor remained steady, held by stone walls and packed clay, and the slow breathing of 3 horses overhead. She sat on the cedar sleeping platform with her back against the wall, the ledger open across her knees. The oil lamp on the narrow shelf threw amber light across the page. Beside her, Sable slept under a single wool blanket, her color better than it had been in 2 winters. Ellis lay on his pallet with one arm folded beneath his head, not quite asleep, watching the lamp flame, the way a person watches something they have decided to trust. Wren wrote the number, 50 degrees. Then she closed the ledger, set it on the shelf beside the Bible, and listened to the storm work itself against the world above her. She had learned to read the storm by sound. The way wind struck the barn boards told her its direction. The rhythm of the horse hooves above, slow and settled, told her the animals were not frightened. The silence between gusts told her the worst was not finished yet. She had lived inside enough Montana winters to understand that a storm which paused was not a storm that had ended. It was a storm catching its breath. 4 months earlier, she had stood in the same barn at midnight with one glove off and a measuring line in her hand. The air around her had been still in a way the cabin never managed even on calm nights. She had pressed her bare fingers against the north wall of the barn and counted to 10. They did not go numb. That small fact had stayed with her longer than most things did. She had not told anyone what she was thinking. Not yet. The cabin had looked like every other homestead structure in Harrow Creek Basin. Log walls chinked with clay and dry grass, a low stone hearth, plank flooring laid over packed earth, a roof patched in 2 places with tarred canvas where the original shingles had split and curled. Decker had built it the year they arrived, 1882, with timber from the draw and stone from the creek bed, and the confidence of a man who had built sound things before. It had stood through 6 winters since then. 2 of those winters Wren had survived alone. The cabin looked proper. That was its problem. When the north wind came down through Harrow Creek Basin in the deep weeks of January proper, became something different from warm. Cold slipped under the floorboards and pooled across the room before the fire caught its rhythm each morning. Frost gathered along the base logs in a thin white line that retreated each afternoon when the sun struck the south wall and returned each night before supper was finished. The door shook in its frame through the long, dark hours. When the wind shifted, smoke pressed back down the chimney and rolled low across the floor until whoever was lying nearest it woke coughing. Wren had stuffed rags into every gap she could reach. She had hung quilts over the 2 north-facing walls. She had pressed dried moss into the failing chinking with her thumbs until the tips cracked and bled. The cabin lost heat faster than the hearth could make it, and she had understood by the second winter that she was not solving a problem so much as arguing with one. She had started keeping numbers that second winter after Decker was gone. Outside temperature, floor temperature before the fire was lit each morning. Hearth output measured by how long it took to boil a pint of water. She was not a woman who had been taught mathematics in any formal sense, but she had grown up in the Schuylkill County coal country of Pennsylvania, where her father worked the anthracite seams from before she could remember, and numbers were the language the earth spoke when you needed to know whether to trust it. Her father, Cormac Elsey, had not been a reader of books. He had been a reader of rock. He taught Wren to press her ear against a tunnel wall and listen for the difference between silence and the particular quiet that came before a ceiling shifted. He taught her to follow water stains on stone to their source rather than away from it. He taught her that every problem a structure had was already visible before it became critical if you looked at it correctly. She had been 8 years old when she learned to identify a failing support beam by the sound it made when you knocked on it, hollow in the middle, solid at the ends. The difference between the two as distinct as a word spoken clearly in a quiet room. She had not used those lessons consciously for years. They had simply waited inside her, the way learned things do, until circumstances required them. The winter of 1887 into 1888 had required everything she had. Sable had been sick for 3 weeks before Wren admitted the sickness was not improving. The little girl ran fever that spiked at night, coughed through the hours after midnight, with a sound that caught in her chest and did not release cleanly. Wren fed the fire through the night and into the gray morning, stuffing the firebox with whatever burned split cottonwood. When she had it, pine slabs from the collapsed section of fence, two ladder rungs from the old orchard ladder that had been leaning against the back wall of the cabin since before they arrived. On the worst night, she made a decision she had never made before. She loaded the firebox beyond its capacity, stacking green cottonwood over the seasoned pieces to extend the heat because she was afraid of what would happen if the fire dropped while Sable was sleeping. She had not thought clearly about what green wood did to a flue. She did not know exactly when the smoke began coming back into the room. She had been asleep herself finally in the chair beside the hearth. What woke her was Ellis standing in front of her with both hands on her arm, his face in the lamplight a color she had never seen on him before. He did not speak. He pointed at his sister's pallet. Sable was unconscious. Wren carried her outside into the snow. Ellis came behind her without being asked in his stocking feet and stood in the dark yard while his mother knelt in the snow and pressed her cheek against Sable's face and felt for breathing. The air outside was 10 degrees below zero. The cold was so complete it had weight pressing down across the basin from the peaks to the north with the indifference of geography. Wren did not register it. She registered only the faint, irregular pull of air against her cheek, and then the small cough that followed it, and then Sable's eyelids moving. She carried the girl back inside. She left the door open until the air cleared, kneeling over Sable and watching the color come back into her lips in degrees. Ellis stood in the open doorway wrapped in a blanket, keeping himself between the wind and his sister, saying nothing, which was a kind of courage Wren recognized but could not speak about then or for a long while after. By morning, Sable was breathing normally. The fever broke 3 days later. The cabin walls were filmed with a faint soot residue that Wren scrubbed away over the following week with rags and hot water, working section by section, because doing the work was the only way she knew to address the terror that had settled into her chest and would not leave through ordinary effort. She wrote in the ledger every evening that winter. The entries were short: temperature, wood consumed, notes on Sable's condition. Occasionally a single analytical line: fire works hard, room does not keep it, or floor cold before dawn despite 4-hour burn. Heat loss from base logs. She did not write about the night she had carried her daughter into the snow. She did not need to. It was already the fixed point around which everything else in her thinking now turned. By the time she stood in the barn in October of 1888, with one glove off and the measuring line in her hand, she had spent 8 months arriving at a conclusion she had been circling since that night. The cabin could not be fixed, not in any way that would matter enough. It was built to look like shelter. It was not built to hold heat the way heat needed to be held, which was by mass, by weight of earth, and stone by depth, by the simple physics of things that change temperature slowly. The cabin was a vessel made of the wrong material, and no amount of moss or quilting or carefully rationed firewood would change its fundamental nature. She already knew what she was going to build. She had known it in a general sense since watching the way the barn held warmth that no fire produced. She had refined it over the intervening months, the way she refined everything through observation, through number keeping, through the patient application of what her father had put into her hands before she was old enough to know she was being educated. She measured the center section of the barn floor by lamplight, the measuring line moving in a grid she marked with a stick of charcoal on each beam above. The oat straw loft ran across the entire upper level, nearly 9 feet of dry, compacted insulation directly above where she intended to dig. The earth beneath the barn had been packed by years of animal weight and was drier than the earth around the cabin, which sat on ground that still received runoff from the slope to the northeast. 3 horses lived above. Their body heat rose slowly through the straw and settled against the roof and never entirely left the building. On the coldest nights the previous winter, she had come into the barn to check on Bram and found the air 20 degrees warmer than the outside temperature without any fire at all. She marked the corners of the excavation with the charcoal: 9 feet wide, 13 feet long, 6 feet 8 inches down. Room enough for 2 pallets, a sleeping platform, a narrow shelf, an oil lamp, a water crock, a single trunk. Not comfortable by any measure a person not facing death would apply. Sufficient by every measure she currently cared about. She stood over the marks for a long time before she went back to the cabin to sleep. In the morning she would need to borrow a mattock. Boone Pickett's homestead sat 3 miles east of hers on ground that was marginally better drained, but received harder wind because it sat without the tree cover that lined the western edge of Wren's property. Boone was 45, a compact man with a methodical quality to his movements that Wren had always associated with people who fix things rather than replace them. He had helped her pull a stuck wagon wheel from the creek crossing the previous spring without making it into anything more than a task to be completed. She respected him for that. She asked for the mattock directly without preamble, which was the only way she knew to ask for things. Boone brought it from the shed and handed it to her, then stood holding the door frame with one hand. She told him what she was building, not because she felt she owed an explanation, but because if something went wrong during the excavation, she wanted at least one other person to know where to look. Boone was quiet for a moment that stretched long enough to contain several different possible responses. Then, "I won't say anything to anyone." Another pause. "But I don't understand why you're doing it." "Because the cabin doesn't hold heat." She took the mattock. "You'll understand when the next hard winter comes." She saw something in his face that was not dismissal, more like a question he had not quite formed yet. He let her take the tool. She walked the 3 miles back with it over her shoulder in the October cold and thought about drainage angles. She dug after feeding the horses and before starting breakfast. She dug again in the afternoon while Ella sat with Sable inside the cabin. She hauled the dirt out in Decker's old bucket one load at a time, using the rope loop he had worn smooth over years of hay hauling, and spread each load across the shallow depressions behind the barn where spring runoff always pooled. From the road, nothing looked unusual. She had considered this before she started. She had considered most things before she started. The first foot of earth was dense clay that rang against the mattock the way frozen ground did even in October, because this particular section of Montana territory had decided some years back to behave like iron. She remembered what her father had done when he needed to break packed earth. Quickly heated water poured into the line of the cut left to work for 10 minutes while you did something else. She boiled water on the cabin stove, carried it across the yard in the covered pot, poured it into the cut lines she had marked. Waited. Then the mattock went in and the earth gave. The work blistered her hands by the third day. She wrapped them in cloth strips cut from an old shirt and kept digging. By the end of the first week, she was 4 feet down the walls, holding their shape in the dry clay better than she had expected. Ellis came to the barn door one afternoon and stood watching her work from above. "Can I help carry?" His voice had the careful quality it had developed in the past 2 years, the sound of a boy measuring his words before he spent them. "The light buckets." He came down and carried without complaint, and she noticed he counted the loads without being asked, to keeping a running number under his breath the way she kept numbers in the ledger. She did not remark on it. Some things were better observed than noted. The first rain came in the second week of November. Not a hard rain, a cold one, moving through the basin at an angle that pressed against the west-facing surfaces of every structure on the property. Wren came down the ladder the following morning with her lamp held low, checking the wall surfaces in the order she had already decided mattered most: north wall first, then south, then west. The west wall had a dark patch the size of her spread hand 3 feet above the floor. She stood in front of it for a full minute. The mark was not dripping. Nothing ran down the wall surface. But the clay in that section had absorbed moisture through a gap in the backing she had not identified. And if October rain did this to it, January snowmelt pressing against the foundation from above would do something considerably worse. She climbed back out, got the spade, dug a diversion trench around the west side of the barn foundation, sloping it away from the structure so that runoff would circle the building rather than press against it. While clearing the line of the trench, she struck stone, not loose fieldstone, but a continuous shelf of natural shale running north to south along the entire western edge of the excavation, 3 inches below the current grade. She stopped digging and looked at it. The shale was impermeable. It was already directing water sideways rather than down, which was why the patch on the west wall was showing moisture from above rather than seeping from the base. If she cut the trench to follow the natural line of the shale, instead of fighting it, the stone would do most of the drainage work for her. She would not need to build a separate clay barrier on that side. The geology had already built one. She stood in the trench for a moment, with the spade across her knees, thinking about what her father would have said about it. Something short and specific. He had not been a man who reached for more words than the situation required. She reset the trench line to follow the shale. Then she went back to the interior and pressed a strip of linen against the dark patch, pinning it to the wall with a wooden peg. She left it overnight. In the morning it was dry. She wrote in the ledger, Westwall answered, "Watch after thaw, stone shelf found, use it." She went to Harlan Goss's store for clay tile the following week. Goss ran the general supply at the south end of Harrow Creek Basin's single commercial block, a wide-fronted building that smelled of feed-grain machine oil and the dried herbs his wife hung from the ceiling joists in bundles. He was a careful man in the way that people who extended credit to homesteaders had to be alert to small signals that told him whether a family was managing or beginning not to. He found the tile section she asked for in the back storage chip pieces, irregular edges priced low because no serious drainage contractor would touch them. She bought enough for the ventilation run she had designed, along with a length of tin sheeting for the funnel she would shape around the flue entry. He set both hands on the counter before she could leave. "What's the tile for a room? Where under the barn?" He looked at her the way a man looks at something that is either impressive or deeply worrying, and he has not yet determined which. He did not ask another question. But when she walked out, the bell above the door had not finished its ring before she heard his voice addressing whoever was in the back of the store about something that had nothing to do with tile or barns or the particular way a widow in the basin was spending her autumn. By Sunday, 3 people in Harrow Creek Basin knew she was digging something under her barn. By the following Thursday, the number had grown in the way that numbers grew in small communities where winter had not yet arrived to give people more immediate concerns. She had known this would happen. She had built the timeline around it, finished before the talking became something she had to respond to. She worked faster. The ceiling beam arrived on a Wednesday, lashed to the flatbed with 2 lengths of rope that had seen better decades. Wren had spent 3 mornings at the collapsed wagon shed on the far edge of her property, working through the wreckage with a pry bar and a handsaw, separating what was worth salvaging from what had already surrendered to rot. The shed had come down in the previous spring's windstorm, a single sustained gust from the northwest that had taken the roof off in one piece the way a hand sweeps a cloth from a table. Most of the valley had written it off as a loss. Wren had looked at the fallen timbers and seen something different. Seasoned wood already dried by years of Montana weather, already past the stage where green lumber would have cracked or warped. She cut away the split ends, first exposing the solid core beneath. What remained was shorter than the original beams, but dense, the kind of wood that rang rather than thudded when you knocked on it. She loaded each piece one at a time onto the small flat sled she had built from fence boards, then hauled it across the frozen ground to the barn with Bram in the traces, the old horse moving at the deliberate pace that was the only pace he had left. 4 beams total. She needed 3 for the main ceiling span, 1 for the cross member above the hatch frame. Before she set any of them, she tested each one the way her father had taught her to test tunnel supports, knuckles along the full length, listening for the change in tone that meant hollow space inside the wood where moisture had worked its way through a hidden crack. 3 of the beams rang clean from end to end. The 4th did not. She found the failure point 14 inches from the center, a section roughly 8 inches long, where the knock produced a sound like a finger striking the back of an empty drawer, rather than the solid report of dense fiber. She could see nothing on the surface. The grain was straight, the color consistent, no visible separation. But the sound did not lie, because sound traveled through structure the same way weight did, and what weight found in a bad beam was what her ear was already hearing. She set that beam aside, went back to the collapsed shed and spent a morning in the cold, pulling 2 more candidates from the deeper wreckage where the fallen roof had protected the lower timbers from the worst of the weather. The second candidate tested clean. She brought it back, seated it in the wall pocket she had already cut into the stone courses on the east and west walls, set the cross member above the hatch, checked the level in both directions, then shimmed one end with a piece of flat shale from the pile she had accumulated during the west wall drainage work. She stood beneath the finished ceiling structure and placed both palms flat against the lowest beam. Solid, unmoving. The kind of stillness that was not absence of force, but equilibrium of it, weight distributed correctly through a structure that had been designed to carry more than it would ever need to. Above this ceiling in the coming months, 3 horses would stand through the long nights of a Montana winter, their combined mass pressing down through the joists and into the stone pockets she had mortared with clay and packed tight. She had calculated the load as best she could, not with engineering tables she did not own, but with the proportional reasoning her father had used in the mines when formal measurement was unavailable. 3 horses combined weight approximately 4,000 pounds, distributed across a floor span of 9 by 13 feet. The beams she had selected could carry it. She was certain of this, the way she was certain of things she had worked through carefully rather than things she had been told. She was also certain she would check the beams again before the first heavy snowfall, then again after. The hatch frame went in on the first cold morning of December when the temperature dropped below 20 before sunrise, and stayed there. Wren worked with her coat on and her breath making small, persistent clouds in the barn's interior air, fitting the rectangular frame into the opening she had cut in the barn floor directly beneath the oat storage bin. The fit required 2 hours of careful adjustment planning edges with Decker's block plane until each side sat flush with the surrounding floorboards. When she set the hatch planks in place and stepped back, they disappeared. Not obviously, not in the way of a stage trick, but in the quiet way that good carpentry disappeared into a surface, the grain of the hatchwood following the grain of the adjacent boards, closely enough that the eye moved across it without stopping. She closed the hatch, walked to the far end of the barn, turned around, walked back. She did not find the seam on the first pass. She had to know where to look before she could see it, which was exactly the result she needed. No outside entrance meant no threshold where snow could pile against a door and give itself away. No stairwell meant no cold air chimney rising from the room below to the barn above. Nothing visible from the yard, from the road, from any angle a passing neighbor or a curious stranger would occupy, gave any indication that the barn floor was anything other than a barn floor. The wind could not steal warmth from a door it could never find. She built the sleeping platform the following week from cedar boards she had kept under a tarp in the cabin since Decker had bought them for a purpose he never specified. Cedar resisted moisture better than pine and had a density that held its shape through temperature changes without warping significantly. She set the platform 16 inches above the floor on 4 short posts, the posts seated in shallow clay sockets she had tamped into the ground and let cure for 5 days. 16 inches was not arbitrary. The coldest air in any enclosed space settled low, a fact she had observed in the cabin where the floor temperature at dawn ran consistently 8 to 12 degrees below the air temperature at waist height. By raising the sleeping surface, she moved the children's bodies out of the coldest band of air in the room without requiring the stove to heat the entire volume. The difference was small. Small differences were what kept people alive through the weeks that otherwise accumulated into catastrophe. She spread a thin layer of wood ash beneath the platform on the packed clay floor. Not for warmth, for moisture. Wood ash pulled humidity downward, creating a slightly drier zone at floor level that would work against the tendency of ground contact surfaces to accumulate dampness through the long, cold months. Her father had used the same material in the mine corridors to manage the underground moisture that rusted equipment and softened timber. She hung the wool curtain on a rod she fashioned from a straight willow branch, positioning it at the base of the ladder to create an air baffle between the hatch opening and the sleeping area. Cold air falling through the hatch would strike the curtain's slow mix with the room air before reaching the beds. She tested it by opening the hatch on a cold morning and standing inside the room watching the lamp flame near the curtain. The flame deflected slightly, not extinguished, redirected. The vent cut came last. She chose the leeward wall, the south face of the chamber, where winter wind would not drive directly against the opening, and cut a narrow slit through the clay backing and the barn wall above. She fitted a sliding wood cover that could be opened partially or fully, then tested the draft sequence hatch closed. Vent cracked, lamp lit at the stove. The flame at the vent opening bent outward, confirming that the room could exhale without losing its heat reservoir through a gap large enough to matter. The room was complete. She stood in the center of it on the evening of the 14th of December and held her lamp at arm's length, turning slowly. Stone walls dry. Clay floor firm underfoot sloped imperceptibly toward the southwest corner, where the gravel drains sat beneath its layer of creek pebbles. Cedar platform level. Wool curtain hanging straight. Shelf narrow but solid. The oil lamp's light reached every corner without leaving any section in shadow deep enough to hide a moisture problem she hadn't found yet. She lit the stove box. Split kindling 2 narrow pieces of cottonwood, the twist of paper at the preheat hole, first draft established before the wood caught. She sat on the edge of the platform and watched the firework while the thermometer on the wall climbed 41 degrees, 46, 51, 54. She let the fire burn 2 hours, then smothered it. 2 hours later, she recorded the temperature 49 degrees Fahrenheit. She wrote below the number the room remembers. Then she made a decision she had not planned in advance. She went back to the cabin, told Ellis she was checking something in the barn and would return before he needed to bank the fire. For the night, took her blanket from the cabin bed, went back to the barn, lowered herself through the hatch, pulled the curtain across behind her, lay down on the cedar platform with her coat still on, and closed her eyes. She woke at 3 in the morning. The lamp had burned low. The room temperature, according to the wall thermometer she read by holding the lamp close, was 46 degrees. She was not cold. Her hands, which she had left uncovered, were warm in the way hands were warm when the surrounding air had not been drawing heat from them through the night. She lay still for a moment listening. Above her, the horses shifted with the slow weight of animals that had settled in for the night. The barn creaked once in the wind, a short, single sound, then was quiet again. The storm that had been building in the northern sky for 3 days had not arrived yet, but she could feel its pressure in the air, not meteorologically, but in the particular stillness that preceded hard weather in Harrow Creek Basin, a stillness that was not peace, but preparation. She was not frightened, she was ready. That was the entire distance she had traveled since October. She climbed back out, went to the cabin, banked the fire, and slept 3 more hours in her own bed before the horses needed feeding. August Fenner arrived on a Tuesday with no announced intention. He was 72 years old, built like a man who had spent decades arguing with stone and mostly won, and he drove a single horse on a flatbed wagon with the unhurried pace of someone who had learned long ago that urgency rarely improved outcomes. He tied the horse at the barn post, stood in the barn doorway, looking down at the hatch frame she had set into the floor, and did not speak for a full 2 minutes. Wren was laying the final course of stone on the north wall, setting each piece with the slight inward lean her father had described for dry stacked walls, not straight because straight relied only on the stone's own weight, while an inward lean put gravity to work, holding the face together rather than pulling it apart. Fenner walked to the edge of the excavation, crouched, looked at the wall. Tilt's right. He stood. Most men build vertical. She nodded and set another stone. He retrieved a short wooden crate from his wagon, brought it back, positioned it near the hatch opening, and sat on it. He pulled a short pipe from his coat pocket and filled it slowly. He did not offer help. He did not ask technical questions. He watched her work for an hour, and at one point, when she was calculating the seat depth for the ceiling beam pockets in the wall, she heard him say quietly and without particular emphasis, "Set the stone pocket before the beam, not after. You can't shim stone the way you can shim wood." She had already planned to do it in that order, but she acknowledged the point. He smoked, she worked. He left before supper without explaining why he had come. She watched the wagon move down the road until it disappeared behind the tree line. Then she went back to the beam pockets. Constance Holt came on a Saturday with no wagon and no advance notice, and 2 other women from the basin whose names Wren knew, but whose opinions she had not found particularly relevant to anything she was doing. They stood in the yard near the barn entrance. They did not come inside. Their voices carried. Children cannot sleep beneath livestock. Constance's voice had the clarity of a woman accustomed to being heard across a schoolroom. That is not a choice a clear-minded mother makes for her family. That is a condition people apologize for, not engineer. Wren was inside the barn, her hands in clay, listening to the carry of sound through the board walls. She did not go to the door. She kept working. That evening, Ellis came inside quieter than usual. He sat at the table while she made supper and looked at the tabletop for a while. Then his voice came level in the way that meant he had been carrying the question for some hours and had decided it was better to ask than hold on to it. "Are we actually crazy?" Wren set the pan down. She looked at her son, 11 years old. Decker's jaw, her eyes, neither of theirs in particular. "No, we're practical." She picked the pan back up. "There's a difference." He absorbed this, nodded once, did not ask a follow-up, which told her it was enough for now, though she knew the question would require a better answer eventually, and that the answer would have to come from something stronger than her word for it. The letter reached Sheriff Dale Pruitt's office in the county seat on the 17th of December, carried by the mail rider who made the circuit through the basin every 10 days when the road allowed. Wren did not know about the letter until the 21st, when Pruitt arrived at her property on horseback in the early afternoon with the manner of a man who had been asked to do something he found professionally uncomfortable. He was 53, lean in the way of men who spent most of their lives in the saddle, With a gray mustache he kept neat because it was the one vanity he permitted himself. He had been sheriff of the county for 11 years. In that time, he had dealt with claim disputes, livestock theft, 2 killings, 1 attempted poisoning, a number of domestic situations that required careful handling, and the accumulated minor crises of a territory in the process of deciding what kind of place it intended to become. He stood in the barn looking down at the closed hatch. Then he looked at the thermometer she had mounted inside the barn near the feed rack. It read 31 degrees. Outside by the post thermometer, it was 4. She says the children are being kept in conditions unsuitable for habitation. His voice held no editorial position. He was reciting a complaint, not endorsing it. Wren did not rush her response. The room is warmer than this barn. This barn is warmer than my cabin. My cabin has 2 children in it tonight because I haven't finished the entry fitting on the hatch. When that's done, they'll sleep below. Pruitt looked at the hatch again. I'll need to come back and inspect it when you say it's finished. I'll be ready. He started toward the barn door, then stopped. On the upturned crate near the hatch frame, she had left the ledger open to that week's temperature records. Pruitt's eyes went to it. What's that? She handed it to him without hesitation. He flipped back 3 pages, reading slowly, following the columns of numbers she had organized by date and measurement type. Outside temperature room, temperature fire duration, wood consume notes. He stopped at a page where she had sketched a cross-section of the vent pipe configuration with measurements and angle notations in the margins. He stood there longer than she expected. He set the ledger down without commenting on it. But when he walked to his horse and mounted, he did not close the barn door with the finality of a man who had made up his mind unfavorably. He left it at the angle he had found it. A small thing. She noted it. Constance Holt had taught the Basin children for nearly a decade. She was 41, originally from Ohio, the daughter of a physician who had believed that women with clear minds should use them in service of their communities. She had arrived in Harrow Creek Basin in 1879 with a teaching certificate, a trunk of books, a husband who died of fever in 1881, and a grief she carried without display, the loss of a daughter who had not survived the winter of 1875 before Constance had ever come to Montana at all. That last fact Wren had learned not from Constance directly, but from the way Constance spoke about children's winter illnesses with a precision that was not clinical detachment, but its opposite, the hyper-specificity of someone who had measured the same distance too many times to speak of it casually. Wren held this knowledge without weaponizing it. It explained the letter to Pruitt, not excused it, but made it legible. A woman who had lost a child in a structure that looked proper had a particular relationship to structures that did not look proper, one that bypassed logic through the faster route of old terror. Wren could not hold that against her in the way she might have held it against someone whose objection was only social. But she could not accommodate it either. She had a room to finish making defensible. On Christmas Eve, she brought the children down for the first time. She did not make it ceremonial. She handed Sable the oil lamp to carry, told Ellis to bring his pallet blanket, lowered herself through the hatch first, then steadied the lamp from below, while Sable descended the ladder with the careful focus of a child who understood that the lamp mattered. Ellis came last, pulling the hatch closed behind him, the way Wren had shown him, fitting the interior latch pin into its bracket. The room received them without drama. 48 degrees by the thermometer. Wren lit the stove, ran the preheat sequence, let the fire run 90 minutes. By the time she smothered it, the thermometer read 53. Sable sat on the cedar platform with her blanket across her knees and looked up at the ceiling. Are we going to live like this all winter? Wren settled onto the platform beside her daughter. Until the ground thaws in April. A pause, then, the horses are up there. Yes. So we're underneath the horses. We're underneath the insulation the horses provide. She adjusted the lamp wick. There's a difference. Sable considered this with the seriousness she applied to most things. Then she lay down, pulled the blanket up, and was asleep within 20 minutes. Ellis stayed awake longer, reading by lamplight from the water-stained copy of a surveying manual that had been Decker's. When Wren finally took the lamp to signal the end of the reading hour, he set the book down without argument. She sat in the dark for a while after both children slept. The room temperature she estimated by feel had not dropped more than 2 degrees since she smothered the fire. The horses moved overhead in their slow nighttime patterns. Outside, she knew without checking the temperature was falling toward 0. Neither of those facts was in conflict with each other in this room. Those Christmas Eve test nights, 3 of them over the following week, gave her what she needed. The room performed within the range she had calculated. She documented each night separately, noting the gap between first descent and the full-time move that would come in January, once she was certain the room had no remaining weaknesses to reveal under sustained occupation. That certainty arrived on the 5th of January when she brought the last load from the cabin and pulled the cabin door closed behind her. She banked the cabin fire to a low-maintenance burn enough to keep the pipes from freezing, not enough to constitute a living space. She carried the water crock, the remaining lamp oil, the Bible, the ledger, the cooking supplies she could fit in the trunk. 3 extra blankets, Ellis's surveying manual. Sable's cloth doll, her own spare coat. She made 3 trips between the cabin and the barn, in the cold moving quickly, the temperature outside -9 by the time she finished. On the last trip, she stood in the cabin doorway for a moment looking at the cold room. The hearthstones, the quilt she had nailed to the north wall, the rags in the floor gaps. All the arguments she had made against the cold that had never quite been enough. She pulled the door closed behind her. That night, the temperature outside dropped to -18. Inside the room below the barn, after a 2-hour fire she smothered at 8 in the evening, the thermometer held at 52 degrees at midnight, 49 at 4 in the morning. Sable slept without coughing. Ellis slept with his arm across his face, which was his habit, and his color in the lamplight was the color of a healthy child rather than the gray around the edges look he had developed by February of the previous winter. Wren sat on the platform edge and wrote numbers in the ledger. Outside, the basin was settling into the cold, the way a body settles into sleep by degrees, then completely. She could feel it in the quality of sound above her, the way the wind had taken on a note she associated with temperatures that stopped being negotiable. She closed the ledger, set it on the shelf beside the lamp, listened to Bram shift his weight above her, the familiar slow creak of the barn boards under 4 deliberate hooves. She did not feel safe. Safety was a condition that required the future to be known, which it never was. What she felt was prepared, precisely and specifically prepared for the particular threat that was organizing itself above the northern horizon, calculated against her family's needs with every resource she had managed to understand and apply. On the morning of January 6th, Bram refused his water. Wren noticed it the way she noticed all significant things, not with alarm, but with the particular attention she gave to deviations from established pattern. The old horse drank every morning within the first 10 minutes of feeding reliably, the way a working animal follows the rhythms its body has organized itself around. She set the bucket in front of him. He turned his head slightly to the side, not away from the water so much as away from the direction the water had come from, which was north. She stood in the barn looking at him for a moment. Then she looked at Ellis, who had come up the ladder to help with the morning feed. He was watching the horse with the same evaluative stillness he had inherited from somewhere between his father's patience and his mother's habit of reading situations before responding to them. The birds were flying south yesterday. His voice was matter of fact. The small ones. All of them at once, like something had decided for them. Wren walked to the barn door, opened it 4 inches, looked at the sky to the north. The color above the peaks was the particular white that was not cloud cover, but atmosphere itself. Air so cold it had become visible, a wall of compressed weather organized against the basin with the impersonal efficiency of geography. She held her bare hand outside the door gap for 5 seconds. The cold did not bite. It pressed, which was different, the difference between a blade and a weight. She closed the door. We go down after lunch. All of us, everything we need. Ellis asked no questions. He finished the morning feed with the economical movements of someone who understood that time had shifted from ordinary to allocated. They were through the hatch by 2 in the afternoon, the latch pin seated in its bracket, the oat bin sitting flush above them. Wren had made the decision to move earlier than the temperature alone would have demanded, because she had learned in the years of watching Montana weather that the worst storms did not announce themselves at full strength. They arrived at partial force first enough to make movement difficult, but not enough to make people stop moving, and then they increased while people were still in transit between where they had been and where they needed to be. She did not want her children in transit when this one reached its full strength. The room was 46 degrees from the previous night's fire. She did not light the stove immediately. She let the family settle, Sable arranging her blanket on the platform, Ellis stacking the extra fuel she had brought down in careful rows near the firebox, both of them conducting the small organizing rituals that turned a space from a place you happened to be into a place you were choosing to stay. Then the knock came through the barn boards above them. Not the sound of weather, the specific irregular rhythm of a human fist against wood. 3 strikes a pause, 2 more. Wren climbed the ladder, lifted the hatch 2 inches, listened. Through the gap, she heard wind that had increased in the past 40 minutes to a register that moved loose objects. Then a voice carrying across the wind with the forced projection of someone who had been calling for longer than they'd expected to need to. She pushed the hatch fully open, climbed out. Boone Pickett stood inside the barn entrance, snow already accumulated on the shoulders of his coat, in a way that meant he had been traveling for some time in conditions that were worsening faster than he had calculated when he started. Beside him, half behind his leg, was his son Thomas, 6 years old, wearing a coat 2 sizes too large that Wren recognized as one of Boone's own, cut down with approximate care. The boy's face was cold, but not yet the dangerous white of exposure. He had been moving. Boone met her eyes directly, no preamble. "Margaret's at her mother's in town. Road closed this morning, she can't get back." A beat. "My cabin is a good structure." Another beat shorter. "I don't trust it tonight." He was not asking for charity. He was making a practical assessment out loud to the one person in Harrow Creek Basin whose practical assessments he had recently revised his opinion of. The distinction mattered to both of them, she thought, in ways neither would articulate. She looked at Thomas. The boy looked back at her with the wide, serious expression of a child who had been told to be quiet and was being quiet very carefully. She stepped to the side of the open hatch. "There's room." Boone descended the ladder with Thomas ahead of him, guiding the boy's feet onto the rungs with his hands, without making it seem like guidance. When he reached the floor of the room and straightened, his face changed in the way faces changed when they encountered something that contradicted a settled expectation. Not dramatically, a small recalibration visible primarily in the eyes. 46 degrees. He had walked through -11 to get here. The differential hit the body before the mind could intercept it, which was the most honest kind of evidence. He looked at the stone floor, then crouched and pressed his palm flat against it, feeling the cold of the packed earth rather than the false warmth of air heated by a stove. Even the floor was warmer than the world outside. He straightened without comment, but the recalibration in his expression had settled into something more permanent. Wren lit the stove. The preheat sequence, the paper twist, the draft pull confirmed before the wood caught. Thomas watched the flame with the total absorption of a cold child near a fire source, and Sable, after a moment of assessment that was purely her own, moved over on the platform to make space and held out the edge of her blanket in an offering that required no words. Thomas sat beside her. Sable covered his hands with the blanket edge. The transaction was complete. The storm arrived at its full strength sometime in the night between the 6th and the 7th. Wren knew it not by any single sound, but by the change in the quality of all sounds together. The barn boards, which had been producing their familiar vocabulary of creaks, began producing something sustained, not the language of a structure settling, but the language of a structure being pressed from multiple directions simultaneously. The horses above moved more than usual in the early hours, not in panic, but in the continuous small adjustments of animals whose environment was demanding something from them. Bram's hooves made their slow, deliberate pattern across the boards. The other 2 horses stayed near the center of their stalls. The room temperature at midnight read 49 degrees. At 4 in the morning, 47. Wren had not lit a second fire. She recorded each reading, noted the outside conditions as best she could estimate them from the sound and pressure she perceived through the structure around her, then returned to the platform edge where she sat with her coat across her lap and the lamp turned to its lowest useful setting. The children slept. Thomas had gone under fully within an hour of arriving, exhausted by the cold travel. Boone sat across the room with his back against the south wall, awake in the manner of a man who was not going to sleep, while someone else's children were in his charge, even if he was not in his own home. Wren appreciated this without commenting on it. Around 3 in the morning, one of the secondary ceiling beams produced a sound, a sharp, resonant crack followed by silence. Boone was on his feet before the echo finished. His hand went to the beam, not knowing what he was looking for, but reaching, because that was what bodies did in the presence of structural sounds in enclosed spaces. His face held the compressed expression of a man running threat assessments faster than language could keep up with. Ellis, who had woken at the sound, was already watching his mother. Wren stood, pressed her knuckles against the beam at the point where the sound had originated. Solid. She knocked along its length, solid, solid, solid. Then she put her palm flat against it and held still, feeling for any micro vibration that would indicate ongoing movement. Nothing. The beam had contracted in the cold, a single event stress release in the fiber, the wood finding its new equilibrium under the temperature load. She had heard this before in the mind tunnels of her childhood, the sound of a material speaking, not the sound of a material failing. Her father had taught her the difference by making her listen to both until she could not confuse them. She looked at Boone. Wood talks when it's cold. Her voice was steady, not performing calm, but actually in possession of it. Wood goes quiet when it breaks. These beams are talking. Boone's hand was still on the beam. He looked at Ellis, perhaps for independent confirmation from someone who had less reason to reassure him. Ellis met his eyes without hesitation. She checked every beam before we moved in. She checked them by sound. She knows which ones are solid. Something shifted in Boone's posture. Not a collapse into relief, more like the recalibration of a man who had revised his prior position and was integrating the revision. He sat back down against the south wall. He did not sleep, but the quality of his wakefulness changed from braced to simply watchful. The beam made no further sounds that night. By the second day, the storm had organized itself into something categorical. The temperature she estimated from the few seconds of exposure she accepted when checking the horses had moved past the range where specific numbers began to lose their individual meaning. It was cold that constituted a different kind of argument than ordinary cold, the kind that made all prior assessments of survival preparation feel preliminary. The horses above remained calm. This was the most important information she had access to. Animals did not perform stoicism. They either tolerated their conditions or they did not. And 3 horses continuing their feeding patterns meant the barn's thermal performance was holding at the level she had designed for. On the second afternoon, Boone climbed the ladder to check the barn, then came back down with snow on his shoulders from the single minute he had spent opening the main barn door to look outside. Drifts are past the fence rails. His voice was even, reporting rather than alarming. The whole place, I could see the chimney from here. It wasn't drawing right. The smoke was flattening instead of rising. He paused. That means the cap is compromised. Snowpack on the flue. Wren was quiet for a moment. She understood what a compromised flue meant in this temperature, the choice between smoke inhalation and opening doors to clear the air, and what opening doors to this wind would do to whatever heat had been accumulated inside. How much space do we have? Her voice carried no warmth in the question, but no coldness either. It was the voice of a woman performing a capacity calculation. Boone looked around the room. Thomas was asleep on the platform beside Sable, both children sharing the blanket that Sable had initiated 2 nights ago, as if it had always been the arrangement. Some, he said. She nodded. Go. Boone was gone 40 minutes. Wren used the time to light the stove and run a full 2-hour fire, the longest she had burned since the storm began, bringing the room temperature to 54 degrees before she smothered it. When the hatch opened again and Boone descended the ladder, he was not alone. Constance Holt came down the rungs with the deliberate care of a woman unaccustomed to ladders, wearing her coat over 2 additional layers and holding a canvas bag against her chest. Her face, when she reached the floor in turn, carried the complex expression of someone who had arrived at a destination they had argued against visiting. She said nothing at first. She looked at the room, the walls, the sleeping children, the thermometer on the wall, the cold ash in the stove box, the ledger on the shelf. Her eyes moved the way eyes moved when they were genuinely processing rather than confirming what they had already decided to see. Sable woke, looked at the new arrival, then looked at her mother. Wren gave her daughter the small nod that meant this was within the range of acceptable developments. Sable reached over to the edge of the platform where a folded spare blanket sat and held it out toward Constance with the same uncomplicated gesture she had offered Thomas 2 nights earlier. Constance Holt took the blanket from the child who lived in the room she had tried to have condemned. She sat down on the 3-legged stool near the south wall, the blanket across her lap, and looked at the ceiling, the underside of the barn floor, the beam faces, the packed clay between them. Her face in that moment carried something that was not readable from the outside, except in its general register, the expression of a person revisiting a fixed position from inside the evidence that had overturned it. Wren understood without Constance having to say it what the woman was seeing, not the room itself. The fact that the room was 52 degrees while the world above it had become uninhabitable. She was seeing that what she had written to Pruitt about unsuitable conditions had been written from inside an assumption that turned out to be wrong. The wrong assumption was that proper-looking structures were safer than improper-looking ones. The evidence available in this room suggested the opposite. Wren did not speak to this. The temperature made the argument on its own. The third night was the storm's measure of everything that remained. Wren sat with the ledger and recorded what she could calculate outside temperature, estimated -31, based on the behavior of the horses and the sound of the wind against the barn's north face. Room temperature, 47 degrees. Hours since last fire, 22. Wood remaining in the interior stack sufficient for 3 more 2-hour burns. She had budgeted correctly. The room had not required more than she had prepared for it. On the third night, Sable developed a low fever. Not the dangerous climbing fever of 2 years before a mild elevation, the kind a healthy body produced when its immune system was working through something minor. But in the confined space by lamplight, Wren felt it when she pressed her lips to her daughter's forehead, and her chest tightened with the specific fear that was not rational, but was not something she could reason herself past. She sat beside Sable on the platform, pulled her close. Sable, half asleep, turned her face toward her mother's shoulder. "Are we buried, Mama?" Wren held her daughter. She thought about how to answer truthfully. "We're held. There's a difference." Sable's eyes were closed. Held by what? Wren looked at the stone walls, the courses she had set one at a time through October. Each piece placed with the inward lean her father had described. Gravity made cooperative rather than adversarial. The clay floor, the cedar platform built 16 inches above the cold that pooled at ground level. The drain pocket in the southwest corner that had performed exactly as designed through 3 months of testing. By things that don't change when the weather does. She adjusted the blanket. By the ground itself, if you understand how to ask it. Sable slept. The fever broke before morning. On the fourth day, the storm paused, not ended, but paused the way a system gathering its final resources pauses before its last statement. Boone climbed the ladder, opened the hatch, stood in the barn for 5 minutes, then came back down. "The Bellwether place has smoke." He sat. "Your cabin is dark, no smoke from the chimney." She had known this would be visible to anyone looking from the road. A dark chimney in a Montana blizzard communicated a specific message to anyone who read the valley. She had accepted this consequence when she made the decision to move the family underground permanently. "Someone will come," Boone said. "Not a question. Let them." Pruitt arrived on the morning of the 9th. He came on snowshoes alone, covering the distance from the county road, with the systematic pace of a man who had decided to do something and was doing it without theatrics. He forced the barn door, which had frozen in its frame from the accumulated pressure of 3 days of drifting. The sound of it opening brought Wren up the ladder before he had fully entered. She was there when he stepped inside, snow still falling from his coat, his face red from the exposure. He looked at her color, her hands, her eyes, the way a man who had expected to find a crisis assessed the absence of one. She opened the hatch. She went down. He followed. The room was 49 degrees. She had run a short fire at 6 that morning primarily to bring the temperature up before the children woke. The stove box held warm ash. The thermometer was readable from the ladder without stepping fully into the room. Pruitt stepped fully into the room. He stood there for a long time. Boone was against the south wall. Constance Holt sat on the stool with the spare blanket across her lap. Her presence in this space, its own form of testimony that required no elaboration. Thomas slept. Sable sat on the platform watching the new arrival with the evaluative calm she applied to most situations. Ellis stood near the stove box with his arms at his sides in the posture of someone prepared to answer questions accurately. Pruitt looked at the thermometer. He looked at the ledger on the shelf. He reached for it and Wren nodded slightly. He opened it to the storm record, 4 days of entries, temperature readings every 4 hours. Wood consumption, noted room conditions, described in the same spare language that characterized every page going back to October. He read for several minutes. The room was quiet except for the residual wind working against the barn above them. He closed the ledger. He looked at Wren with the expression of a man who had ridden 2.5 miles through -28 degrees to perform a rescue and had instead found himself standing in the warmest room in Harrow Creek Basin. "How much wood did you burn?" His voice was not rhetorical. "Since the 6th. She had the number precisely. slightly less than 1/6 of a cord. Short fires, evening burns mostly. The room carries the rest. He absorbed this. She knew from the slight change in his expression that he was comparing the number against something he knew from his own experience. The arithmetic of the situation was making its own argument without any assistance from her. I don't have an official reason to be standing in this room. He looked around it one more time. The walls, the ceiling, the drain corner, the sleeping platform, the children. I came because a dark chimney in a blizzard means something in this county. A pause. It means something different here. He looked at Wren directly. I see a design that works. His voice carried the weight of a man who did not offer that sentence lightly. Whatever anyone wrote in a letter, that's what I see. He climbed the ladder. She heard him speak briefly to his horse, heard the barn door pulled to behind him, heard the snowshoe creak of his departure diminishing across the drifted yard. August Fenner came the morning after the storm finally released its full claim on the basin. He came without announcement as he always did, driving the same flatbed at the same unhurried pace. He tied his horse at the barn post, walked into the barn, found the hatch open. She had been airing the room through the clear cold of the post-storm. Morning descended the ladder without being invited, stood in the room, looked at the cold ash in the stove box, the temperature on the wall thermometer, the sleeping platform where both children had left their blankets folded. He was quiet for a long time. He moved to the clay floor near the drain corner and crouched, pressing his fingers into the packed surface, reading it the way a man reads something he recognizes from long experience. The floor was dry. After 3 months of winter occupation and 4 days of the worst storm the basin had seen in a decade, the floor was dry. He sat on the three-legged stool. He looked at the ceiling beams. Decker would have been proud of you. His voice was quiet, carrying no performance. It was the statement of a man who had known Decker Calloway and was making an honest assessment. Wren received this without deflection. She nodded once. There were no words that improved on that exchange, so neither of them attempted any. He climbed out after a few minutes. She listened to the flatbed move down the road. She stood alone in the room for a moment, looking at what she had built, not with the pride of someone who had overcome opposition, but with the simpler satisfaction of someone who had defined a problem correctly worked. The solution carefully tested it under conditions that removed all ambiguity and been right. Being right had not required anyone's permission. The storm had been the only authority whose opinion she needed, and the storm had rendered its judgment in the only currency it understood: the survival of the people inside the things she had built. In the weeks that followed, the basin processed what the storm had taught it. Boone Pickett came back in February with a notebook. He sat in the room with Wren for 2 hours asking questions she answered without embellishment. He was not writing down her words. He was writing down measurements, wall thickness, vent dimensions, the height of the sleeping platform, the depth of the drain pocket, the geometry of decisions that had worked. He was a man who understood that the most useful knowledge was transferable, which meant it had to be specific. Constance Holt did not come back to the room. She did not need to. What she had experienced in 4 days of involuntary residence had done its work without any conversation Wren could have initiated deliberately. In March, Constance stopped Wren outside the general store and spoke to her for the first time since before the storm. The conversation was brief. Constance said she had written a second letter to Pruitt, this one retracting the concerns raised in the first, and that she had done this because accuracy mattered more to her than consistency. Wren said she understood. She meant it. Pruitt himself said nothing further officially. But when Harlan Goss began fielding questions about clay tile, more of it than he had ever ordered, Pruitt was among the first men in the basin to stop by the store and examine the stack with the careful attention of someone developing an informed opinion. The measurements the storm had produced were not comfortable reading for anyone who had heated a conventional cabin through the same 4 days. Nearly 2 cords consumed at the bellwether place, the family still cold. The Goss store's east room had frozen pipe damage that would require spring repair. 2 families in the southern end of the basin had burned furniture after their wood supplies ran short by day 3. Wren had burned less than 1/6 of a cord. Her children had slept through most of it. By the time April came to Harrow Creek Basin and the ground began its slow release from the winter's grip, Ellis was already asking questions of a different kind. Not whether they had survived, that was settled. He was asking what they would do differently. She gave him the ledger. He sat at the table in the cabin they had returned to it in late March when the temperatures normalized and read through the entire winter's record. Temperature notations repair notes the west wall entry from November, the beam test from December, the 4-day storm record. He turned pages with the focused attention of someone not reading for the story, but for the information embedded in it. When he finished, he looked up. The vent slider is too small. When you cracked it open, the room temperature dropped faster than it needed to. A wider slider with 3 graduated positions would let you control the air exchange without surrendering the heat. She had noticed the same thing. She had not written it in the ledger yet because she had been waiting to see if Ellis would find it on his own. Write it down. He opened the ledger to the first blank page after the storm record. He wrote the date, then the observation, then a small sketch of a revised slider mechanism with 3 graduated positions rather than 2. He studied the sketch for a moment, added a dimension note in the margin, then set the pencil down. Beneath the sketch, he wrote in his own hand the same 2 words she had used through the Autumn Holds Better. She read it over his shoulder. She did not correct the handwriting or add anything to the page. The phrase was accurate. It applied now to more than the room, to the knowledge itself which had moved from her hands into his, into Boone's notebook, into the basin's collective understanding of what shelter actually required, as opposed to what shelter was traditionally assumed to provide. She was not famous for any of this. The basin did not erect anything in her name or hold any ceremony. What it did was more durable than either of those things. It changed how people built. Not uniformly, not all at once, but in the specific way that a demonstrated truth spreads through a practical community, through the decisions made the following autumn by men with notebooks who were ordering clay tile in quantities Harlan Goss had not previously stocked. Ren Calloway had not invented the principle. Earth held heat, stone held heat. Mass held what fire gave it, while the structure above turned the wind aside. People had understood this in one form or another since long before Montana Territory existed as a named place on a map. What she had done was apply it precisely in specific materials to a specific problem under specific conditions, with enough documentation that the application could be understood, evaluated, replicated, improved. She had made the knowledge transferable. That was the whole of it, and it was enough. Outside, the morning after Fenner's visit, she stood in the yard with the post-storm light coming off the snow at an angle that made everything in the basin sharp-edged and specific. Ellis came out of the barn from the morning feed and stood beside her. The temperature was 12 degrees cold, but the cold of a system that had expended itself, not one that was organizing. What do we fix first? His breath made small clouds in the still air. She looked at the barn. The west side of the foundation where she had cut the drainage trench in November, now buried under the storm's snowpack, would need inspection when it thawed. The vent slider on the south wall needed the graduated mechanism Ellis had sketched. The cedar platform had developed a slight unevenness in one corner she had noted in February but not yet addressed. She opened the ledger to the first page she had written that October, then to Ellis's entry at the end, then to the blank pages that remained. Everything that can be better. She handed him the ledger. Write it down. He took it. She picked up the shovel, leaning against the barn wall. The work of the next season had already begun, in the way that necessary work always began. Not dramatically, not with announcement, but with the simple forward motion of someone who understood that the storm this year had been survived by what was built last autumn, and the storm next year would be survived by what was built now. She started toward the drainage trench. The ground was still frozen solid beneath her boots. But she knew from everything she had learned about how Earth held and released its conditions in its own time and on its own terms that it would not stay that way. Spring always came to Harrow Creek Basin eventually, and when it did, there would be work to do, measurements to take, weaknesses to find before they became failures. She had a ledger with blank pages. She had a son who already knew how to fill them. She kept walking.